I am Daniela Peterson, 24 years old. 2 weeks ago, at my own college graduation dinner, my father did something that made me decide to surgically remove myself from his life. Picture this: the Scioto Country Club in Columbus, Ohio, 50 guests sitting around silk-draped tables, the clinking of crystal and the low hum of old money. It was supposed to be my night. I had just earned my degree in data analytics from Ohio State, working night shifts to pay for my own tuition because my family refused to contribute a single dime. My father, Gregory Peterson, tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The room quieted down. He stood at the head of the table wearing that tailored charcoal suit he wore like a second skin. He raised his glass, but he did not look at me. He looked to his right, at my older brother Julian. Before we get to the minor milestones, my father said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room, I want to propose a toast to the real future of the Peterson legacy. Julian has just been named vice president at Crestview Capital. Now that is an achievement worth celebrating. 50 people clapped. Julian leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon, wearing a smirk he had been perfecting since childhood. My mother, Sylvia, reached over and patted his hand. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible at my own dinner, but my father was not done. He finally turned his gaze down the table to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He tossed it down the long mahogany table. It slid to a stop right in front of my plate. And for Daniela, he said, the warmth draining from his voice, your late Grandpa Theodore wanted you to have this. Since you lack your brother ambition, I suppose Theodore thought a participation trophy was fitting. I opened the box. Inside rested a tarnished, heavy brass medal. It was ugly, industrial, and smelled faintly of rust. My father chuckled, looking around at his friends. For the daughter who takes the slow lane. Let us hope she eventually figures out what to do with her life. The room erupted in laughter. Casual, comfortable laughter. The kind people make when they are glad they are not the punchline. I looked at the heavy brass medal. I looked at my brother's smug face. I looked at my father, expecting me to lower my head in shame. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I picked up the heavy brass trinket, closed my hand around it, and stood up. I looked my father dead in the eye, offered a polite, chilling smile, and said, "Thank you. I know exactly what to do with it." Then I turned my back on 50 laughing guests and walked out the heavy oak doors into the warm Ohio night. Have you ever sat at a table full of people who share your blood only to realize you are nothing but a prop for their egos? If you know what it feels like to be the family punchline, I want you to comment the word enough below. Let me know I am not alone. And if you want to see what happened when I figured out what that ugly piece of brass actually was, keep watching. Because my father thought he was handing me garbage, but he was handing me the keys to an empire. To understand how we got to that dining room, you need to understand the Petersons, and you need to understand why walking away from their money was the most profitable decision I ever made. I am Daniela Peterson, 24 years old. 2 weeks ago, at my own college graduation dinner, my father did something that made me decide to surgically remove myself from his life. Picture this: the Scioto Country Club in Columbus, Ohio, 50 guests sitting around silk-draped tables, the clinking of crystal and the low hum of old money. It was supposed to be my night. I had just earned my degree in data analytics from Ohio State, working night shifts to pay for my own tuition because my family refused to contribute a single dime. My father, Gregory Peterson, tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The room quieted down. He stood at the head of the table wearing that tailored charcoal suit he wore like a second skin. He raised his glass, but he did not look at me. He looked to his right, at my older brother Julian. Before we get to the minor milestones, my father said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room, I want to propose a toast to the real future of the Peterson legacy. Julian has just been named vice president at Crestview Capital. Now that is an achievement worth celebrating. 50 people clapped. Julian leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon, wearing a smirk he had been perfecting since childhood. My mother, Sylvia, reached over and patted his hand. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible at my own dinner. But my father was not done. He finally turned his gaze down the table to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He tossed it down the long mahogany table. It slid to a stop right in front of my plate. And for Daniela, he said, the warmth draining from his voice, "Your late Grandpa Theodore wanted you to have this. Since you lack your brother ambition, I suppose Theodore thought a participation trophy was fitting." I opened the box. Inside rested a tarnished, heavy brass medal. It was ugly industrial and smelled faintly of rust. My father chuckled, looking around at his friends. "For the daughter who takes the slow lane, let us hope she eventually figures out what to do with her life." The room erupted in laughter. Casual, comfortable laughter. The kind people make when they are glad they are not the punchline. I looked at the heavy brass medal. I looked at my brother's smug face. I looked at my father, expecting me to lower my head in shame. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I picked up the heavy brass trinket, closed my hand around it, and stood up. I looked my father dead in the eye, offered a polite, chilling smile, and said, "Thank you. I know exactly what to do with it." Then I turned my back on 50 laughing guests and walked out the heavy oak doors into the warm Ohio night. Have you ever sat at a table full of people who share your blood only to realize you are nothing but a prop for their egos? If you know what it feels like to be the family punchline, I want you to comment the word enough below. Let me know I am not alone. And if you want to see what happened when I figured out what that ugly piece of brass actually was, keep watching. Because my father thought he was handing me garbage, but he was handing me the keys to an empire. To understand how we got to that dining room, you need to understand the Petersons. And you need to understand why walking away from their money was the most profitable decision I ever made. I drove north on Interstate 71 that same night. I left the Columbus city limits behind and watched the highway stretch into the dark toward Cleveland. My graduation dress was still on. The heavy brass medal sat on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Honda Civic. It caught the amber glow of the passing streetlights. Every time I glanced at it, I felt the phantom sting of my father mocking laughter. Within a week, I signed a lease on a fourth-floor walk-up in downtown Cleveland. The floors sloped. The radiator clanked like a dying engine during the night. The window looked out over an alley lined with overflowing dumpsters. It was a far cry from the 6-bedroom colonial I grew up in. But the door had a deadbolt, and my name was the only one on the lease. For the first time in 24 years, I breathed clean air. I took a job as a junior supply chain auditor at a mid-sized logistics firm near the Cuyahoga River. The title sounded corporate. The reality was grueling. I spent 60 hours a week staring at complex logistical spreadsheets. I tracked shipping containers, audited freight invoices, and hunted for financial discrepancies hidden deep within thousands of rows of data. It was relentless, unglamorous work. My eyes burned by the end of every shift. But my degree in data analytics taught me one crucial truth. Numbers never lie. People lie. Systems lie. Egos lie. But the raw data always tells the true story of where the power sits. While I was hunting for pennies in corporate spreadsheets, my family was busy performing their wealth back in Columbus. You have to understand the dynamic to understand what they were hiding. My mother, Sylvia, operated on a policy of elegant erasure. She did not yell. She simply pretended I did not exist. If I called her on a Sunday, the phone rang until it hit voicemail. If I attended a holiday dinner, she would look right past my shoulder to ask the caterer a question. To her, a daughter who wanted to work in data rather than marry into a country club membership was a failure of her own parenting. And then there was Julian, the infallible golden child. Julian carried the Peterson name like a weapon. He worked in finance, but his real job was spending our father money. Julian drove an $80,000 Porsche Macan. It was leased, of course. He wore custom Italian suits and ordered $1,000 bottles of wine at business dinners to impress clients he had not actually secured yet. From the outside, Julian looked like a titan of industry. But because I audited financial systems for a living, I knew how to recognize a fragile facade. Julian had no equity. He only had optics. There was only one person in the Peterson family who understood the difference between optics and equity: Grandpa Theodore. Theodore was my father, but they could not have been more different. Gregory Peterson built a career on real estate speculation and schmoozing city council members. He liked clean hands and velvet ropes. Theodore was a man of iron and grease. For 40 years, Theodore ran an industrial scrap business on a sprawling, gritty lot on the industrial outskirts of Cleveland. The rest of the family treated Theodore like an embarrassing secret. They hated his stained work boots. They hated the smell of motor oil that lingered on his jackets. They only tolerated him because his business generated the seed money Gregory used to buy his first country club membership. I loved that scrapyard. When I was a little girl, Theodore used to let me walk the perimeter with him. He would point to mountains of rusted steel, crushed copper wire, and oxidized aluminum. "To a fool, this just looks like trash, Daniela," he told me once. We were standing in the freezing November rain, watching a crane lift a crushed sedan. But everything has a baseline value. You just have to strip away the rust to find the core. He reached into his pocket that day and handed me a heavy, unpolished piece of raw brass. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "Remember this?" he said, looking at me with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Value is about what things are made of, not how they shine." I kept that philosophy close to my chest as I sat in my freezing Cleveland apartment. The financial cutoff from my parents was swift and brutal. My father canceled my cell phone plan 3 days after the graduation dinner. He removed me from the family health insurance policy the following Monday. He expected the sudden drop into poverty to break me. He expected me to drive back down to Columbus, knock on his heavy oak door, and beg for an administrative job at his real estate firm. He expected me to apologize for walking out on his joke. He fundamentally miscalculated who he raised. I embraced the isolation. I realized very quickly that being ignored by toxic people is not a punishment. It is the ultimate operational advantage. While they spent their energy maintaining their shiny, expensive illusions, I was left alone to build my expertise in silence. No family dinners to attend, no passive-aggressive text messages from Sylvia to decode, no listening to Julian brag about a non-existent promotion. I had nothing but time, my spreadsheets, and my quiet growing understanding of how real wealth moves through supply chains. I worked. I saved. I learned. Every day I sat at my desk and dismantled complex financial structures line by line. I learned how shell companies hide assets. I learned how zoning laws dictate land value. I learned how industrial properties harbor secrets that residential developers never think to look for. I became an architect of information, and every night I came home to my cramped apartment. I would empty my pockets, tossing my keys on the counter. Next to my keys sat the tarnished graduation medal my father had thrown at me. I kept it there on purpose. I let it be the first thing I saw when I woke up, and the last thing I saw before I turned off the lamps. It fueled my grinding routine. I thought it was just a piece of ugly metal, a cruel reminder of the night I finally walked away. I had no idea I was staring at a map. The silence from Columbus lasted exactly 6 months. 6 months of grinding 50 and 60-hour work weeks. 6 months of building an ironclad work ethic. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, the quiet broke. I was sitting in my cubicle cross-referencing a freight ledger when my cell phone vibrated. It was a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, an email dropped into my inbox. The sender was a senior partner at a prominent law firm located in the most expensive zip code in Columbus. The subject line was formal and chilling. Estate of Theodore Peterson. Summons for will reading. Grandpa Theodore had passed away quietly in his sleep. My family had not even bothered to call and tell me he was gone. They just let the lawyers handle the notification. A tight, cold knot formed in my chest. Not just from the grief of losing the only man who ever saw me, but from the realization of what this meant. Theodore owned acres of industrial land. He owned heavy machinery. He owned a lifetime of capital, and my father Gregory was the executor of the estate. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor. The summons demanded my presence in Columbus the following week. They were going to carve up Theodore legacy, and they wanted me in the room. They did not want me there out of respect. I knew my father. He wanted me there so he could perform his final act of dominance. He wanted to force me to watch Julian inherit the kingdom while I was left holding the scraps. I printed the email, folded it perfectly in half, and slid it into my purse. The quiet chapter of my life was over. The corporate warfare was about to begin. If you are dealing with a family that values you based on what you can do for their image, you know the anxiety that comes with a sudden summons. You know the exact knot in the stomach I felt that afternoon. Hit the like button if you have ever had to walk into a room full of relatives knowing you were walking into a trap. Because when I walked into that mahogany-lined office in Columbus, my father tried to hand me the ultimate insult. He thought he was locking me into a cycle of poverty and humiliation, but he failed to realize that the daughter he banished had spent the last 6 months learning exactly how to read the fine print. And the fine print was about to change the trajectory of the entire Peterson bloodline. I took a Tuesday off from the logistics firm, put on my single-tailored charcoal blazer, and made the 2-hour drive back down Interstate 71 to Columbus. The law offices of Gallagher and Associates occupied the penthouse floor of a downtown high-rise. The reception area smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. When I walked into the main conference room, my family was already seated at the long mahogany table. They wore their grief like a curated fashion exhibit. My mother, Sylvia, wore a black designer dress, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the panoramic window. My father, Gregory, and my brother, Julian, sat shoulder to shoulder in matching dark suits. Nobody stood up when I entered. Nobody offered a greeting. I pulled out a heavy chair at the far end of the table and sat down in silence. Mr. Gallagher, a senior partner with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and opened a thick manila folder. He did not offer condolences. He operated with clinical efficiency. I respected that. He verified our identities, stated the date for the record, and began reading the last will and testament of Theodore Peterson. As the legal jargon filled the room, I watched my father. Gregory tapped his polished leather shoe against the carpet. He was eager. Theodore had always lived modestly, wearing grease-stained overalls and driving a beat-up pickup truck, but my father knew the scrap business generated serious capital. Theodore was a child of the Great Depression. He hoarded cash and invested quietly. Gregory was banking on that quiet wealth to fund his next real estate venture. Gallagher reached the distribution of assets. He read the first major allocation. To my son Gregory Peterson, I leave the entirety of my liquid cash accounts, the municipal bond portfolios, and the mutual fund trusts totaling approximately $2.8 million. Gregory let out a slow, controlled breath. He tried to maintain a solemn expression, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. He had just secured his safety net. Gallagher continued. To my grandson Julian Peterson, I leave the deed to the primary residence in the Upper Arlington district free and clear of any mortgage obligations. Julian leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. A house in Upper Arlington was worth nearly $1 million on the current market. Julian now had a massive, tangible asset to borrow against. He looked across the table at me, his eyes gleaming with unearned triumph. They had received the shine, the liquid capital, and the premium real estate. Then Gallagher turned a page. He looked over his glasses, his gaze landing directly on me. To my granddaughter Daniela Peterson, I leave the deed to the 2-acre industrial scrap lot located in the Cleveland industrial sector. Gallagher paused, consulting a secondary document. Please note, Miss Peterson, this property carries an active environmental flag from the city due to decades of metal and chemical runoff. It is currently assessed at a negative value due to the pending remediation requirements. Gallagher slid a sealed envelope across the mahogany table. It stopped inches from my hands. Theodore also left this personal correspondence for you. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cardstock. Theodore's handwriting was sharp and jagged. It contained one sentence. The soil is poisoned, but the foundation is yours. You already hold the key. Julian let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. A toxic scrapyard, Julian said, shaking his head. Do you even know what an EPA remediation mandate costs, Daniela? You are looking at a minimum of $50,000 just to clear the contaminated topsoil, not to mention the commercial property taxes. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You are a junior auditor making what? $45,000 a year before taxes. That plot of dirt is going to bankrupt you before you even hit 25. My father did not intervene. He sat there letting Julian deliver the financial execution. The message was clear. Theodore had not left me an inheritance. He had left me a liability, a financial anchor designed to drag me underwater. My mother finally turned her gaze away from the window. She looked at me with an expression of profound pity. Do not be stubborn about this, Daniela, Sylvia said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. You cannot afford to maintain a commercial industrial site. Your credit score will be ruined. Just sign the deed over to your brother. Julian can absorb the liability through his firm as a tax write-off. It is the only sensible solution to save you from financial ruin. They had orchestrated this exact pivot before I even arrived. They wanted me to feel the terror of unmanageable debt, so I would hand over the only piece of land Theodore actually worked on. They wanted to strip me of the one final connection I had to my grandfather. I looked at the deed waiting on the table. I looked at the environmental warning attached to the back page. As an auditor, I understood the raw numbers. Julian was right about the tax burden and the cleanup costs. On paper, it was a fiscal nightmare. But I remembered Theodore's hands pressing that piece of raw brass into my palm years ago. I remembered his voice telling me to strip away the rust to find the core. Theodore did not make mistakes. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out my own pen, and leaned over the table. I signed my name on the transfer deed. I accepted the lot. I accepted the environmental flags. I accepted the taxes. Julian's jaw dropped. What are you doing? I just told you it is a liability. I capped my pen and stood up. I know how to read a balance sheet, Julian. I will handle my own liabilities. I walked out of that law office with the deed to a poison scrapyard and a cryptic note burning a hole in my pocket. Let me stop right here and tell you something crucial. Toxic families will always try to hand you their garbage. They will give you the blame, the debt, the liabilities, and the impossible tasks, hoping the weight of it will crush you into submission. They hand you their trash because they think you are a dumpster. But what they fail to realize is that sometimes they are actually handing you the keys to your own empire. When I got back to Cleveland that night, I did not cry over my contaminated inheritance. I took out the tarnished graduation medal my father threw at me, and I finally looked at it under a bright light. And that is when the real game began. I returned to my Cleveland apartment as a winter storm rolled off Lake Erie. The wind rattled the loose window panes, casting long, fractured shadows across the scuffed hardwood floor. I dropped my keys on the chipped Formica counter. Next to them, I placed the deed to the scrap lot, the environmental warning citation, and the tarnished graduation medal. I made a cup of black coffee and sat at my small kitchen table. The silence in the room was heavy. I read Theodore's cryptic note again. The soil is poisoned, but the foundation is yours. You already hold the key. My father thought Theodore was a senile hoarder. Julian thought Theodore was a fool who wasted his life moving rusted steel. But I knew my grandfather. Theodore built an empire out of discarded materials because he understood inherent value. He never spoke in riddles unless there was a lesson attached. I picked up the brass medal. It felt cold against my palm. I tossed it in the air and caught it. I did it again. My brain, trained to analyze discrepancies in supply chain logistics, snagged on a physical inconsistency. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. It has a specific predictable density. I looked at the dimensions of the metal. It was roughly 3 inches in diameter and half an inch thick. I knew the mathematical formula for volume. I calculated the expected mass in my head. The numbers did not align with the physical object resting in my hand. The metal was too dense. It was too heavy to be standard decorative brass. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up a periodic table and a metallurgical density chart. I compared the estimated weight of the metal against common industrial metals. It was not brass. It felt closer to tungsten or a specialized titanium alloy coated to look like cheap tarnished brass. Why would a man who spent his life dealing in scrap metal disguise a high-grade alloy as a cheap participation trophy? I needed a closer look. I dug through my supply drawer and found a jeweler loop I used for inspecting damaged circuit boards and reading micro-printed serial numbers at work. I turned on the harsh fluorescent desk lamp and angled the bulb directly over the metal. I pressed the loop to my right eye and leaned in close. To the naked eye, the surface of the metal looked crude. It featured a generic crest and a series of rough scratches around the outer edge. But under 10 times magnification, the illusion dissolved. The scratches were not accidental damage. They were deliberate. They were perfectly uniform laser-etched grooves. I adjusted the focus on the loop. The grooves formed a sequence. Zeros and ones, binary code. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a notepad and a pen. I carefully rotated the metal under the light, transcribing the microscopic binary sequence line by line. The etching was a masterpiece of hidden engineering. It took me nearly an hour to record the entire string of numbers hidden along the rim. When I finished, I sat back and stared at the page. I opened a translation program on my laptop and typed in the sequence. The binary did not translate into a simple message. It translated into two distinct sets of numbers: latitude and longitude. I copied the coordinates and pasted them into a mapping application. The red pin dropped onto a satellite image of downtown Cleveland. It did not point to the scrapyard. It pointed to a brutalist concrete building located in the financial district. I searched the address. It belonged to Northern Reserve Depository, a highly secure private vault facility utilized by hedge funds and elite private wealth management firms. I looked back at the metal under the light. The generic crest in the center was not a design. It was a precise custom-milled physical access key engineered to fit a high-security receptor. The air in the apartment felt different. The parameters of my reality shifted. Grandpa Theodore was not a humble junkman. He was a strategic mastermind. He had spent decades playing an entirely different game than my father. Gregory spent his life chasing country club approvals and leveraging debt to buy shiny things. Theodore drove a rusted truck and quietly accumulated actual untraceable power. Theodore knew exactly who his son and grandson were. He knew Gregory was vain. He knew Julian was greedy and financially incompetent. If Theodore had left his true wealth in a standard trust, Gregory would have tied it up in litigation, draining the accounts to fund his own failing real estate ventures. If Theodore had left it to Julian, my brother would have squandered it on leased sports cars and bad investments. So Theodore set a trap. He gave them the shiny things. He gave them the cash and the houses, knowing they would snatch the bait without a second thought. And he gave me the dirt. He gave me the environmental liability. He wanted to see if I had the fortitude to accept the foundation when it looked like a burden. He tested my character and he tested their greed. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I walked over and checked the screen. It was a text message from my mother, Sylvia. The message was brief. Your father is willing to discuss taking that toxic property off your hands if you realize you made a mistake. Call him. I stared at the glowing text. The timing was too perfect. My family did not do favors. Gregory did not offer to take on liabilities out of the kindness of his heart. If my father wanted that Cleveland scrap lot, it meant he already knew something about it, or he was planning to use it for a tax scheme. Julian had likely run the numbers and realized they could flip the land to a commercial developer once the environmental flag was cleared. They were circling me. They thought I was a scared, broke 24-year-old girl holding a worthless piece of paper. They were already plotting to legally force me out of the deed for quick cash. I deleted the text message without replying. The dynamic had changed. I was no longer the victim of their financial abuse. I was the architect of their impending ruin. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Northern Reserve Depository website. The site required a registered account number just to access the contact page. I looked at the string of binary code I had transcribed. There was a short sequence of digits at the very end of the coordinates. I typed those digits into the login portal. The screen refreshed. A welcome prompt appeared displaying Theodore name, It offered a scheduling calendar for private vault access. I selected the earliest available appointment for the following morning at 9 o'clock. I closed the laptop and picked up the heavy metal key. The coldness of the alloy matched the new rhythm of my pulse. My family spent my entire life trying to erase my value. They mocked my work ethic. They laughed at my inheritance. They threw this piece of metal at me like a scrap for a stray dog. They had no idea that the stray dog was about to unlock the gate to the slaughterhouse. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my table watching the winter storm batter the city. I thought about Julian tailored suits and Gregory tailored lies. I thought about the sheer arrogance it took to hand your own daughter a piece of trash in front of 50 people. The era of my silence was over. Tomorrow I was going to walk into that private depository and find out exactly what kind of empire my grandfather left behind. The Northern Reserve Depository sat like a concrete fortress in the center of the Cleveland Financial District. I arrived 10 minutes before my 9 o'clock appointment. The wind coming off the lake cut right through my thin wool coat, but I did not feel the cold. I carried the heavy brass key inside my pocket, my fingers tracing the hidden laser-etched grooves. I felt the weight of Theodore's secret grounding my every step. The lobby was an exercise in sterile intimidation. Polished marble floors, thick bulletproof glass, and armed security guards wearing tailored suits. A concierge directed me to a private elevator without speaking a single word. The car descended 3 floors below street level. A vault manager waited for me in a dimly lit antechamber. He did not ask my name or request a driver license. He simply held out a velvet tray. "Place the primary access token here, please," he said. I placed the tarnished graduation medal on the velvet. The manager did not flinch at the sight of the ugly, rusted metal. He carried the tray down a long corridor lined with stainless steel doors. We stopped at a private viewing room containing a single mechanical terminal and a polished steel table. "Insert the token into the receptor," he instructed, gesturing to a slot on the terminal. "Once the mechanism engages, the depository box will deploy. I will wait outside." The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him, sealing me in the silent room. I held my breath. I lifted the heavy brass alloy and aligned the custom-milled edges with the receptor slot. It slid into place with a satisfying, precise click. A series of heavy tumblers rotated behind the steel wall. The sound was deep and mechanical, echoing in the confined space. A secondary door slid open, revealing a long black metal lockbox. I pulled the box onto the viewing table and lifted the lid. There were no sentimental photographs. There were no handwritten letters telling me he loved me. Theodore was a man of industry, not emotion. The box contained thick stacks of legal documents bound by heavy industrial clips. I spread them out across the table. My eyes, trained by months of hunting for discrepancies in supply chain audits, went straight to the executive summaries. The first stack was a geological survey conducted by an independent mining commission 3 years ago. The subject property was the 2-acre Cleveland scrapyard I now owned. I read the soil analysis line by line. The topsoil was indeed contaminated with motor oil and rust, exactly as the city environmental flag claimed. But the survey did not care about the topsoil. It focused entirely on the bedrock. According to the core samples, the land sitting beneath Theodore rusted sedans and crushed aluminum contained the largest untapped rare earth mineral deposit in the state of Ohio. The report detailed high concentrations of neodymium and praseodymium. As a data analyst who tracked global supply chains, I knew exactly what those elements meant. They are the critical components required to manufacture electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, and smartphone microchips. They are the most sought-after materials in modern tech manufacturing. Theodore had not left me a toxic dump. He had left me a gold mine engineered for the 21st century. I picked up the next stack of papers. These were municipal zoning approvals. Theodore had spent the last 5 years quietly navigating city council red tape. He successfully rezoned the scrap lot for commercial excavation, shielding the true purpose of the permits under the guise of deep soil environmental remediation. The paperwork was airtight, stamped and certified by the City Planning Commission. Then I found the binding contract. It was a preliminary lease agreement executed with a global tech manufacturing conglomerate. The terms were staggering. The conglomerate agreed to a $45 million mineral rights lease spanning 10 years with an upfront operational payout of $5 million. The signature line for the conglomerate was already executed by their chief executive officer. The line for the property owner remained blank. A small yellow sticky note rested on the signature page. Theodore handwriting was unmistakable. The terms are frozen until the heir holding the token signs the release. Do not let the suits negotiate you down. I sat back in the leather chair. The silence of the underground vault pressed against my ears. I thought about my father celebrating his $2 million in liquid cash back in Columbus. I thought about Julian gloating over his Upper Arlington house. And then at the bottom of the lockbox, I found one final document. It was a forensic financial audit Theodore had commissioned on his own son and grandson. I reviewed the ledger. Gregory Real Estate Empire was a crumbling house of cards. His commercial properties were leveraged to the brink of default. He had taken out high-interest mezzanine loans against every building he owned to maintain his country club lifestyle and project a false image of wealth. Julian was in even worse shape. The house Theodore left him was supposedly free and clear, but the audit revealed Julian carried a mountain of unsecured personal debt from his failed day trading ventures and leased luxury vehicles. My brother and father needed Theodore liquid cash just to survive their own bad math. They inherited life preservers with gaping holes in them. I inherited the ocean. Let us pause for a second. Think about the poetic justice of a family obsessed with superficial shine. My father and brother spent their entire lives judging people by the cars they drove and the labels on their clothing. They looked at a rusted piece of metal and saw garbage. They looked at a contaminated lot and saw ruin. They were blinded to raw fundamental value because they only respected things that glittered. If you have ever watched arrogant people dig their own graves because they refused to look beneath the surface, you know the exact sense of vindication I felt in that vault. I did not shed a tear. I did not celebrate. I operated with the cold precision Theodore expected of me. I pulled my pen from my purse. I turned to the signature page of the $45 million tech conglomerate lease. I signed Daniela Peterson on the dotted line. I flipped to the depository authorization forms and updated the banking routing numbers to a secure private offshore account I set up during my auditing work. I locked the geological surveys and the executed contracts back inside the black box. I took only the confirmation receipts and the heavy brass key. I slid the box back into the wall. The tumblers rotated, securing my new empire. I walked out of the Northern Reserve Depository and back onto the freezing Cleveland streets. I was no longer a junior auditor living paycheck to paycheck. I was a multi-million-dollar property magnate, and my family had zero idea. I unlocked my 10-year-old Honda Civic and sat in the driver's seat. I turned on the engine to get the heater running. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to check my work email. Instead, the screen lit up with 3 missed calls and a priority voice message. The caller ID belonged to my father, Gregory. I pressed play. The audio filled the cold car. "Daniela, it is your father." Gregory's voice was tight. The smooth, arrogant tone from the graduation dinner was gone. It was replaced by something sharp and hurried. "Julian and I have been discussing your situation with the Cleveland property. We are trying to help you. Julian knows a local commercial developer who is willing to take that toxic nightmare off your hands for a flat $50,000. It is a favor. You need to drive down to Columbus tomorrow so we can execute the transfer before the city fines you for the soil damage. Call me the minute you get this." I stared at the dashboard. My heart rate slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. They were not just arrogant, they were desperate. Julian's finance background meant he had likely run his own checks on the property. He did not know about the tech conglomerate or the $45 million lease, but he definitely knew the land was worth more than a negative tax burden. He was using a phantom developer to steal the deed for pennies on the dollar to cover his own catastrophic debts. The game was escalating. The emotional neglect was transforming into active financial extortion. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the city traffic. I was not going to run. I was going to let them walk right into their own trap. I did not return my father's phone call that morning. Instead, I drove straight to my cubicle at the logistics firm, brewed a cup of cheap office coffee, and put my auditing skills to work. Gregory had sent a follow-up email while I was driving detailing his generous proposition. He provided the name of the supposed savior willing to buy my poisoned inheritance, Vanguard Horizon Development. I set my coffee mug down and opened the Ohio Secretary of State online business registry. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the filing. Vanguard Horizon Development was not a commercial warehouse builder. It was a shell company. The Limited Liability Corporation had been formed exactly 4 days ago. The registered agent listed on the filing was a downtown Columbus attorney. I opened a second tab and cross-referenced the attorney name against public corporate records. The search yielded a direct hit. The attorney served as outside compliance counsel for Crestview Capital, my brother firm. I leaned closer to my monitor. The puzzle pieces began to lock together. I ran a deeper public records search on Julian Personal Holdings. The data painted a grim, undeniable picture. Julian had pledged the deed to his new Upper Arlington house as collateral for a high-risk brokerage margin account. He had been shorting tech stocks betting against the market. But the market shifted. The brokerage firm issued a margin call. They demanded immediate liquidity to cover the bad trades. Julian had no liquidity. Theodore cash accounts were still locked in probate, and my brother was staring down a default that would cost him his house and his prestigious vice president title. He needed a quick flip to survive. He planned to acquire my Cleveland lot for $50,000, scrub the environmental flag, using his corporate connections, and sell the underlying land to an actual developer for $1 million. He was trying to steal my inheritance to plug the holes in his sinking ship. I accepted the invitation to Gregory Columbus' office for a Thursday afternoon meeting. Gregory operated out of a high-rise in the Arena District. His suite was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows, frosted glass partitions, and a sprawling mahogany desk that took up half the room. When I walked in, Gregory sat behind the desk, wearing a tailored navy suit. Julian paced near the window, checking his phone every 10 seconds. His knuckles were white. He wore a Rolex Daytona, but his posture screamed desperation. "Daniela," my father said, standing up and offering a warm, practiced smile. "Have a seat. Can I get you a sparkling water?" I declined the drink and sat in the leather guest chair. I kept my posture relaxed. I rested my hands in my lap. I did not speak. I let the silence hang in the room, forcing them to fill the void. Gregory cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. "We are worried about you, sweetheart. Julian and I have been running the numbers on that scrap lot Theodore left you. The property taxes alone are going to drain your savings account by December, and the city is already preparing to levy fines for the soil contamination." Julian stopped pacing and stood beside Gregory's desk, playing the role of the protective older brother. "It is a disaster, Daniela. Theodore was out of his mind to leave that burden to someone on a junior auditor salary. But we leveraged some favors. I have a contact at Vanguard Horizon Development. They specialize in rehabilitating toxic commercial sites. They are willing to take the deed off your hands for $50,000. $50,000, Gregory repeated, letting the number hang in the air as if he were offering me a winning lottery ticket. "It is clean cash, Daniela. You can pay off your student loans. You can put a down payment on a nice little condo in the suburbs. We are trying to protect your future." I looked at my father. I looked at my brother. I thought about the $45 million tech conglomerate lease currently locked in a subterranean vault in Cleveland. I thought about the offshore account waiting for the first $5 million operational payout. Then I deployed my weapon. Silence. I did not call Julian a fraud. I did not reveal that I knew Vanguard Horizon was a shell company. I did not mention the rare earth mineral deposit. I just looked at them with a blank, polite expression. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20. The psychological weight of the quiet room began to crush them. Abusers and manipulators rely on your reaction. They need you to argue, cry, or defend yourself so they can control the narrative. When you give them nothing, their script falls apart. Julian tapped his expensive watch. Did you hear what we said, Daniela? We are offering you an exit strategy. I smiled. It was a cold, precise smile. I appreciate the concern, Julian. But I am keeping the property. Gregory dropped the warm patriarch act. His jaw tightened. The fake smile vanished. You are not thinking rationally. You do not have the capital to hold that land. You are going to ruin your credit score out of sheer stubbornness. I am very comfortable with my current liabilities, I said, standing up from the leather chair. Thank you for the advice. If Vanguard Horizon Development wishes to make a formal offer, they can send it through certified mail. I turned and walked toward the heavy glass door. Daniela. Stop walking away from me, Gregory commanded. His voice echoed off the floor to ceiling windows. You sign that deed over, or you are going to regret the financial consequences. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. I looked back at the two men who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I will take my chances, I replied. I opened the door and left them standing in their tower of debt. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever watched someone try to sell you a glass of water while you are standing in the middle of a lake? If you know the quiet satisfaction of holding all the cards while toxic people try to bluff you into folding, hit the subscribe button. Because what happened over the next few days proved exactly how far my family was willing to fall. The moment I returned to Cleveland, the digital barrage began. Julian panic morphed into Gregory fury. Over the next 72 hours, my father sent me 14 emails and 24 text messages. I did not reply to a single one. I simply archived them. I built a chronological digital paper trail. The first few emails were patronizing. Gregory reiterated that I was a young, inexperienced girl making an emotional mistake. By the second day, the tone shifted to veiled threats. He promised to use his influence in the Ohio business community to ensure no bank would ever give me a mortgage. By the third day, the messages became explicit coercion. He threatened to drag me into probate court and sue me for the legal fees if I did not sign the quitclaim deed to Vanguard Horizon. Every email, every threatening text, every desperate voicemail went directly into a secure cloud folder on my laptop. They thought they were intimidating me. They were actually handing me the exact evidence I needed for a civil extortion case. I was letting them dig their own legal grave one keystroke at a time. I sat in my apartment on a rainy Sunday evening, reviewing the dossier I had compiled against my own blood. I had Julian margin call data. I had the shell company filings. I had Gregory coercive threats in writing. The trap was fully set. I just needed the perfect moment to spring it. I closed my laptop and poured a glass of cheap red wine. The apartment radiator hissed in the background. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was not Gregory this time. It was my mother, Sylvia. The text message was brief, formal, and dripped with artificial sweetness. Daniela, your father and brother are very stressed. Let us put business aside. Please come to the house for dinner on Friday. Just the four of us. We need to heal this family divide. I stared at the screen. Sylvia never reached out to me unless she wanted something for the men in her life. This was not a peace offering. It was a coordinated ambush. They realized the emails were not working, so they were changing the battleground to their home turf. I typed a single word in response. Okay. I hit send. I set the phone face down on the counter. The boardroom guillotine was inevitable, but first I was going to let them serve me dessert. I drove back down to Columbus on a Friday evening. The Upper Arlington neighborhood was draped in quiet wealth. Manicured lawns, long winding driveways, and luxury sedans parked in front of sprawling colonial homes. I pulled my Honda Civic into my parents' driveway, parking it right behind Julian leased Porsche. My mother, Sylvia, opened the heavy oak front door before I even reached the porch. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater and a string of pearls. She smiled, pulling me into a brief, rigid hug that smelled of expensive perfume and gin. Daniela, she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. We are so glad you came. Family needs to stick together during stressful times. I stepped into the foyer. The house looked exactly as it had during my entire childhood. Pristine, untouchable, and suffocating. Gregory sat in the living room holding a glass of scotch. Julian leaned against the marble fireplace. They both offered tight, orchestrated nods. The scene was staged perfectly. They were playing the roles of the gracious, forgiving patriarchs welcoming the difficult daughter back into the fold. We moved to the formal dining room. Sylvia had gone through the trouble of hiring a private caterer. We ate roasted lamb and asparagus off fine china. For the first 45 minutes, the conversation was aggressively normal. Sylvia talked about the country club renovation. Gregory discussed a recent golf tournament. Julian bragged about a new client he was supposedly courting at Crestview Capital. They did not mention Grandpa Theodore. They did not mention the Cleveland property. They wove a web of comfortable, mundane chatter, trying to lull me into a false sense of security. I ate my dinner in silence, watching the performance. I knew the blade was coming. I just did not know when they were going to drop it. The caterer cleared the dinner plates and brought out dessert. It was a rich chocolate tart served with espresso. The moment the caterer retreated to the kitchen and the dining room doors swung shut, the temperature in the room dropped. The performance was over. Gregory set his espresso cup down. He laced his fingers together and rested them on the mahogany table. Julian reached down to the empty chair beside him and picked up a thick manila envelope. "We brought you here tonight because this situation has gone on long enough," Gregory said. His voice lost the warm paternal cadence. It was hard and commanding. "You have had your little rebellion, Daniela, but playtime is over." Julian pulled a document from the envelope. He slid it across the polished wood. It stopped right next to my dessert plate. It was a pre-drawn quitclaim deed. The paperwork legally transferred ownership of the Cleveland industrial lot directly to Julian. The signature line for Vanguard Horizon Development was gone. They had abandoned the shell company ruse. Julian was taking the land in his own name. "Sign it," Julian instructed. He tossed a silver pen onto the table. It clattered against the fine china. I looked at the document. I did not touch the pen. I kept my hands folded in my lap. "Real estate is a high-stakes arena," Julian continued, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "It requires strategic thinking. It requires a level of intellect you simply do not possess. You are a junior auditor, Daniela. You count boxes in a warehouse. You do not have the temperament to manage commercial property. You are going to trigger a tax default and drag our family name through the mud." My mother took a sip of her espresso. "Julian is right, sweetheart," Sylvia said, her tone smooth and reasonable. "Women in our family do not engage in dirty industrial businesses. It is unbecoming. Let your brother handle the heavy lifting. He has the financial acumen to navigate this properly." I looked at my brother. The man who was currently drowning in margin calls and unsecured debt was lecturing me about financial acumen. I felt a slow, cold wave of clarity wash over me. Their arrogance was not just toxic, it was a terminal disease. "What happens if I decline?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and level. Gregory leaned forward, invading my space across the table. "If you decline, you are no longer part of this family. I will write you out of my will tomorrow morning. You will never step foot in this house again." I let his threat hang in the air. Then Julian played his final card. "It gets worse the next communication," Daniela, Julian sneered. "You work in logistics. You rely on corporate networking. Dad and I know every major executive in the Ohio supply chain sector. If you walk out of here without signing that deed, we will make a few phone calls. We will tell them you are unstable. We will say you stole family assets. We will smear your professional reputation so thoroughly that no firm in the Midwest will ever hire you again. You will be unemployed and bankrupt before Thanksgiving." They were threatening my livelihood. They were attempting active, undeniable extortion. What they did not know was that my hand was resting inside the right pocket of my blazer. My thumb was pressed against the side of my cell phone. Ohio is a one-party consent state. That means as long as one person involved in a conversation consents to being recorded, the audio is fully admissible in a court of law. My phone voice memo application had been running since I walked through the front door. It captured Sylvia fake greeting. It captured Julian blatant misogyny. And it captured Gregory direct threat of financial sabotage. I sat perfectly still. I did not raise my voice to defend my intelligence. I did not argue about my career. When you are sitting on a mountain of rare earth minerals and a $45 million tech lease, the opinions of desperate men hold zero weight. I stood up from the dining room table. I looked down at the silver pen and the quitclaim deed. I will not be signing this, I stated. The color drained from Gregory's face. Julian stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Did you hear what I just said to you? Julian demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. We will ruin you. I pushed my chair in. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I heard you, Julian. Have a wonderful evening. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I did not run. I did not look back. I heard Gregory shouting my name from the hallway, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I opened the heavy oak front door, stepped out into the cool night air, and got into my car. The entire drive back to Cleveland, the recording sat safely stored on my hard drive. Let me pause the story right here. We need to talk about the psychological power of the word no. Have you ever noticed how toxic people react when you simply refuse to participate in their drama? They expect you to fight. They expect you to cry. They design their traps to feed off your emotional friction. When you sit perfectly still, look them in the eye and give them a calm, unshakable refusal, you destroy their entire illusion of control. You strip them of their power. If you have ever stopped a manipulator in their tracks by simply refusing to play their game, leave a comment below. Share your moment of boundary setting, because establishing that boundary is the most liberating thing you can ever do. But drawing a line in the sand comes with a price. When a narcissist realizes they cannot control you with threats, they escalate. They stop trying to manipulate you and start trying to destroy you. My family realized their intimidation tactics had failed. They realized I was not going to hand over the inheritance. So they stopped playing nice. Julian returned to his desk at Crestview Capital the following Monday morning. He was out of time, out of money, and out of options. He decided to use his corporate access to launch a devastating attack on my property. He thought he was striking a fatal blow, but he did not realize he was launching a missile at a fortified bunker, and the ricochet was about to end his entire career. The drive back to Cleveland felt different than any drive I had ever taken. I left Columbus with a digital recording of my own family attempting to extort me. By the time I crossed the Cuyahoga River and parked outside my apartment building, the adrenaline faded, replaced by cold calculation. I knew Julian would not stop. A desperate man staring at bankruptcy does not simply walk away from a potential lifeline. He claws at it. He digs his nails in until they break. Julian had less than a week before his brokerage firm liquidated his Upper Arlington home to cover his bad market bets. He needed the Cleveland land immediately. Since intimidation failed, he resorted to legal sabotage. On Wednesday morning, I received a certified envelope at my desk at the logistics firm. It was a formal notice from the Cuyahoga County clerk. A mechanical encumbrance had been filed against my 2-acre industrial lot. The document claimed an outstanding debt of $150,000 for unpaid soil remediation consulting. The claimant was a subsidiary of Vanguard Horizon Development. Julian had placed a fraudulent lien on my property. In the real estate world, a lien is a chokehold. It clouds the title. It prevents the owner from selling, refinancing, or leasing the property until the supposed debt is settled in court. Julian's strategy was clear and brutal. He wanted to tie the land up in expensive litigation. He assumed I was a broke junior auditor who could not afford a $200 an hour defense attorney. He expected me to panic, call Gregory in tears, and surrender the deed just to make the lawsuit disappear. He was operating under the assumption that I was standing alone. He forgot I was holding a $45 million tech conglomerate lease. I did not call my father. I did not panic. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a private number located on the back of the depository contract I had locked in the underground vault. The number connected me directly to the senior executive legal counsel for the tech conglomerate. These were not local Columbus lawyers who played golf at the Scioto Country Club. These were international corporate litigators who protected billion-dollar supply chains. I explained the fraudulent encumbrance. I emailed them a scanned copy of the county notice. The senior counsel did not sound concerned. He sounded annoyed that a local finance broker was attempting to disrupt their rare earth mineral excavation timeline. He told me to return to my auditing work and let them handle the pest control. The crushing reality of corporate power is a beautiful thing to witness when it works in your favor. Julian thought he was a heavy hitter because he wore a Rolex and had a vice president title at a regional finance firm. He was playing in a sandbox. The conglomerate legal team dropped a tactical nuke on his sandcastle. Within 48 hours, the tech conglomerate attorneys filed an emergency injunction in the county court. They presented undeniable proof that Vanguard Horizon was a shell company with no operational history, no employees, and no equipment capable of conducting soil remediation. The judge dismissed the fraudulent lien immediately and issued a severe judicial warning against the claimant for filing a false encumbrance. Julian's attempt to choke my property lasted exactly 2 days. The defense was flawless, but defending yourself only keeps you alive. It does not win the war. I wanted to win. I wanted to ensure my brother and my father could never threaten my livelihood again. I switched from defense to active offense. I am a data analyst. I track hidden variables for a living. When you file a commercial lien electronically with a county clerk, you leave a digital footprint. You leave an internet protocol address. You leave metadata. I stayed late at my office on Friday night. The logistics floor was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I logged into my terminal and began pulling the public electronic filing records from the county database. I isolated the exact timestamp of the Vanguard Horizon lien submission. I extracted the routing data. Julian was arrogant. Arrogance makes people sloppy. He did not hire a proxy to file the false documents from a remote location. He filed them himself, and he did not do it from his home network. He used the secure servers at Crestview Capital. I stared at the IP address on my monitor. My brother had utilized his employer proprietary financial network to commit felony real estate fraud. He used a regulated investment firm server to file a fake lien against his own sister. The moment the compliance officers at Crestview Capital saw this data, Julian would be terminated, stripped of his financial licenses, and reported to the federal regulatory boards. I started building a dossier. I gathered the digital footprint of the lien. I printed out the shell company registration linking Vanguard Horizon to the Crestview Capital outside counsel. I attached the geological surveys proving the land was actually worth tens of millions of dollars, establishing the motive for the theft. I printed the forensic audit Grandpa Theodore had left me detailing Gregory over leveraged commercial loans and Julian toxic margin debt. Finally, I created a secure transcript of the audio recording from the Columbus dinner party. I typed out every threat. I typed out Gregory promising to cut me out of the will. I typed out Julian promising to smear my professional reputation to every logistics firm in the Midwest. I placed the USB drive containing the raw audio file into a plastic sleeve. I sat at my desk for 6 hours organizing the documents into a thick leather binder. I used plastic dividers to separate the financial crimes from the extortion attempts. The binder was heavy. It smelled of fresh ink and crisp paper. It contained the undeniable destruction of the Peterson family facade. It proved wire fraud and corporate malfeasance beyond any shadow of a doubt. If I mailed this binder to the police, my father and brother would face criminal investigations. If I mailed it to the Ohio banking regulators, Julian's career would evaporate overnight. If I mailed it to Gregory creditors, the banks would immediately recall his commercial loans and seize his properties. I held the hammer. I had the power to shatter their lives with a single trip to the post office. But I did not mail it. Not yet. If you drop the hammer too early, the impact is absorbed. People find loopholes. They hire defense attorneys. They spin the narrative and paint themselves as victims of a misunderstanding. I needed a stage. I needed to let them feel secure. I needed them to escalate one final time, committing an act so undeniable and so public that no lawyer in the state could save them. Let us talk about the concept of leverage. Most people think leverage is about shouting the loudest or throwing the first punch. Real leverage is silent. Real leverage is watching someone dig a hole, handing them a larger shovel, and waiting until they are too deep to climb out. Have you ever held a piece of information that could end an argument instantly, but you chose to wait for the perfect moment to reveal it? That discipline is the difference between winning a battle and winning the war. I packed the 50-page dossier into my briefcase. I walked out of the empty logistics firm and stepped into the cool Cleveland night. My brother thought he was clever. My father thought he was untouchable. They had no idea they were already dead men walking. The weekend passed quietly. I went to the grocery store. I drank coffee by my window. I waited for their next move. I knew the dismissed lien would send Julian into a tailspin. He was out of time. The margin call deadline was approaching. The legitimate pathways to save his house were gone. The intimidation tactics had failed. The legal sabotage was crushed by unseen corporate giants. When cornered, a narcissist will abandon all logic and resort to sheer, unadulterated betrayal. I knew Gregory would step in to save his golden boy. I just did not anticipate how far my father was willing to go to protect the son he valued over the daughter he despised. On Tuesday morning, the final line was crossed. My father committed a crime so bold it guaranteed his own destruction. The weekend faded into a tense Monday. I knew the silence from Columbus was a temporary ceasefire. Julian deadline was closing in. His brokerage firm was preparing the final paperwork to liquidate his assets. He was out of legal maneuvers. The tech conglomerate had crushed his false lien with surgical precision. When cornered animals realize the trap is locked, they chew off their own limbs to escape. Gregory Peterson was a man who built his entire identity on the illusion of control. He looked at Julian and saw a reflection of himself. If Julian went bankrupt, the Peterson legacy fractured. Gregory could not stomach the humiliation of his country club peers whispering about his son's financial ruin. He needed to secure the Cleveland property to bail Julian out. Since I refused to hand it over, Gregory decided to take it. On Tuesday morning, I sat at my desk at the logistics firm reviewing a freight manifest. At exactly 10:15, my cell phone rang. It was not a Columbus area code. It was the private offshore number for the tech conglomerate senior legal counsel. I stepped out of my cubicle and walked into an empty conference room. I locked the door and answered the call. Miss Peterson, the attorney said, his voice clipped and professional. Did you visit the Cuyahoga County Clerk office this morning to authorize a transfer of deed for the industrial lot? My blood ran cold. No, I replied. I have been at my desk since 8 o'clock. The attorney let out a dry sigh. That is what we suspected. Someone just attempted to file a quitclaim deed transferring ownership of your property to a Julian Peterson. The filing was submitted in person at the county registrar. I leaned against the conference room wall, processing the raw data. How did you know? I asked. When we execute a multi-million-dollar mineral lease, we do not leave the asset vulnerable, the attorney explained. We placed a corporate title monitor on the deed the moment you signed our contract. Any attempt to alter, encumber, or transfer the title triggers an automatic 72-hour freeze and alerts our legal department. The clerk scanned the document into the system and our software intercepted it instantly. The transfer is blocked. He paused, the silence heavy through the receiver. I am sending you a secure email with a scan of the submitted document. I need you to verify the signature. I walked back to my desk and refreshed my inbox. An encrypted PDF appeared. I opened the file. It was a digital copy of the exact quitclaim deed Julian had slid across the dining room table last Friday. The document was filled out in blue ink. At the bottom of the page, on the line designated for the current owner, sat my name, Daniela Peterson. I stared at the screen. The handwriting was not mine. It did not even look like a convincing imitation. It featured sharp, panicked loops and heavy pen pressure. It was my father's handwriting. Gregory had physically forged my signature. He did not stop there. The document carried a fresh notary stamp. Gregory had leveraged one of his shady real estate connections in Columbus to illegally notarize a forged signature without me being present. He thought he could drive to Cleveland, file the fake deed, and steal the land right out from under me. He assumed the county clerk would process the paperwork transferring the title to Julian, giving them the collateral they needed to stop the margin call. He treated my inheritance like it was just another zoning loophole to exploit. Let us stop for a moment. I want you to think about the people who raised you. We all accept that our parents are flawed. We accept that they make mistakes, harbor biases, and sometimes fail to protect us. We can rationalize emotional distance. We can even rationalize a graduation dinner insult. But there is a terrifying defining moment when you look at a piece of evidence and realize your parent is not just flawed. You realize they are actively dangerous. My father did not just insult my intelligence. He did not just favor my brother. Gregory Peterson looked at my life weighed it against Julian comfort and decided my basic legal rights did not matter. He decided he had the authority to steal my property. He viewed me as a disposable asset. Have you ever experienced that exact moment of clarity? The moment you realize the person supposed to protect you is the person holding the knife. If you have survived the realization that your family is a legitimate threat to your safety, type the word truth in the comments. Acknowledge that pain, because acknowledging it is the only way to conquer it. Standing in that empty conference room looking at my forged signature, I felt a sudden sharp pang of grief. It was not grief for the father I had. It was grief for the father I never had. I mourned the realization that I would never get a phone call checking on my well-being. I would never have a parent who was proud of my hard work. I was permanently orphaned by their greed. I allowed myself to feel that grief for exactly 60 seconds. Then the grief evaporated, leaving behind a cold, unshakable resolve. The emotional warfare was over. Gregory had just crossed a fatal line. Forging a signature on a real estate transfer is a felony. Conspiring with a corrupt notary is a felony. Filing a fraudulent deed with a county clerk is a felony. My father had not just hurt my feelings. He had committed grand larceny and wire fraud. He handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle his entire life. I picked up the phone. The tech conglomerate attorney was still waiting on the line. That is not my signature. I stated, my voice steady and devoid of any hesitation. My father forged it. Understood, the attorney replied. The title remains secure. The transfer is void. How do you wish to proceed, Miss Peterson? We can turn this over to the local district attorney, or we can handle it civilly first. If we handed it straight to the police, Gregory would be arrested quietly. I did not want quiet. I wanted a public reckoning. I wanted the country club elite to watch the Peterson legacy crumble in real time. I want to file a civil suit for real estate fraud, extortion, and forgery, I instructed. I want Julian named as a co-conspirator. I want every asset they own frozen pending litigation. Can your team draft the filings and secure the subpoenas by Friday? The attorney let out a low chuckle. It was a sound of pure corporate predation. Miss Peterson, we have a division of litigators who live for this exact scenario. We will have the subpoenas signed by a judge within 48 hours. I thanked him and ended the call. I walked back to my cubicle and packed my bag. I told my logistics manager I needed to take a few personal days. The battleground was shifting. We were leaving the living rooms and the country club dining tables. We were entering the unforgiving arena of the legal system. In the legal system, charm does not work. Tailored suits do not work. Only evidence matters. And I had a mountain of it. I knew exactly where I was going to serve them. Gregory and Julian were scheduled to host an elite networking brunch at the Scioto Country Club this coming weekend. They invited bankers, real estate developers, and local politicians. They planned to use the brunch to project an aura of wealth and stability, pretending Julian's financial crisis did not exist. They assumed the forged deed would clear by Friday, saving their empire just in time for mimosas. They thought they had won. I went home and opened my closet. I bypassed the cheap slacks and the worn-out blouses I wore to the warehouse. I reached into the back and pulled out a pristine tailored designer suit I had purchased with my first auditing bonus. I paired it with sharp heels. If you are going to drop a guillotine on your abusers, you should always dress for the occasion. I was going to drive down to Columbus, crash their high society brunch, and hand-deliver the consequences they spent a lifetime avoiding. The drive down Interstate 71 on Saturday morning felt remarkably serene. The sky over Ohio was a pale, cloudless blue. I did not listen to the radio. I drove in silence, letting the hum of the tires ground me. In the passenger seat rested a slim leather briefcase containing the future of the Peterson family. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Scioto Country Club just before 11 o'clock. The valet attendant, a young kid in a white polo shirt, hesitated for a fraction of a second when I handed him the keys to my 10-year-old Honda Civic. It stood out like a sore thumb among the line of gleaming Mercedes and Lexus sport utility vehicles. I tipped him $20 and walked up the pristine stone steps. I did not look like the girl they mocked at graduation. I wore a tailored slate gray suit crafted from Italian wool. The cut was sharp and unforgiving. My hair was pulled back into a sleek professional knot. I wore a pair of dark leather heels that clicked with authority against the marble floor of the lobby. A man in a beige trench coat sat in a wingback chair near the coat check. His name was Thomas. He was a licensed private process server hired by the tech conglomerate legal team. I caught his eye. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had the thick legal envelopes resting in his lap. I walked past him and approached the double doors of the grand ballroom. The brunch was in full swing. The room smelled of fresh lilies, roasted carving meats, and expensive champagne. 50 of the most influential people in the Columbus business district mingled around high-top tables. I saw local city council members. I saw the managing partners of 3 different regional banks. I saw real estate developers who held the keys to the city infrastructure. And in the center of it all stood my father and my brother. Gregory held a crystal flute of mimosa, laughing heartily at a joke told by a bank executive. Julian stood next to him, looking relaxed for the first time in weeks. He wore a custom navy blazer and a smug, easy smile. They were celebrating. They were operating under the delusion that the forged quitclaim deed had processed successfully on Friday afternoon. They thought they owned the Cleveland land. They thought Julian Margin Call was funded. They thought they had outsmarted the quiet daughter. My mother, Sylvia, was the first one to spot me. She was standing near the mimosa bar, chatting with a group of country club wives. Her eyes drifted toward the entrance and locked onto mine. The polite smile froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her designer makeup looking like a harsh mask. She excused herself from the women and walked rapidly toward me, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. "Daniela," she hissed, keeping her voice low so the surrounding guests would not hear. "What are you doing here?" "You were not invited. I am attending a networking event, Sylvia," I replied evenly. I did not break my stride. I walked past her deeper into the ballroom. Sylvia grabbed my elbow, her manicured nails digging into the wool of my suit. "You need to leave right now," she demanded, her voice tight with rising panic. "Your father has important investors here. He is closing a major deal. Do not embarrass us." I stopped and looked down at her hand until she released her grip. "You should worry about your own embarrassment, Sylvia. I am just here to deliver a message." By now, Gregory had noticed the commotion. He excused himself from the bank executive and strode across the room. The false warmth he projected for his guests evaporated the moment he reached us. He positioned his body between me and the crowd, trying to form a physical barrier. "What is wrong with you?" Gregory muttered, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched near his temple. "Did you come here to beg? Because you are too late? The paperwork is already filed. The land is ours. Julian is saved. Now get out the back door before I have security throw you onto the street." He was so confident. He truly believed his forgery had worked. He had no idea the tech conglomerate corporate monitor had intercepted his felony before the ink was even dry. I looked my father in the eyes. I did not shrink away from his imposing height. "You should go make your toast, Gregory. Your guests are waiting." Julian joined the circle, holding his drink. He looked me up and down, taking in the designer suit and the calm demeanor. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but his arrogance quickly smothered it. "Let her stay," Julian sneered. "Let her watch how real business is done. Maybe she will learn something about capitalism. Gregory smoothed his tie, regaining his composure. He gave me one final glare of warning. You stay in the corner and keep your mouth shut. He turned his back on me and walked to the center of the ballroom. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against his crystal glass. The bright conversational hum of the room faded into expectant silence. The guests turned their attention to the patriarch. Thank you all for coming today. Gregory began projecting his voice with practiced charisma. We are gathered here to celebrate the enduring strength of the Columbus business community. But more importantly, I want to raise a glass to the future. Julian stepped up beside him, beaming with unearned pride. As many of you know, Gregory continued, my son Julian is expanding his portfolio. He has recently acquired a highly lucrative commercial asset that will cement his position as a leader in regional development. He has proven that with the right strategy, any obstacle can be overcome. I caught the eye of Thomas, the process server, waiting just outside the open ballroom doors. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Thomas walked into the room. He did not look like a wealthy investor. He looked like a man on a mission. The crowd parted instinctively as he marched straight toward the center of the room. Gregory paused his speech, his brow furrowing in confusion, as the stranger approached the makeshift stage. Gregory Peterson. Thomas asked, his voice cutting through the silent ballroom. Yes, who are you? Gregory demanded. Thomas pulled a thick, sealed envelope from his coat pocket and pressed it directly against Gregory's chest. You have been served. Thomas then turned to Julian. Julian Peterson. Julian blinked, stepping back, but Thomas shoved a second identical envelope into his hands. You have also been served. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen. Thomas turned on his heel and walked out the front doors, disappearing as quickly as he arrived. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the 50 guests. The bank executives stared. The city council members exchanged nervous glances. Being served with legal papers in the middle of a high society event was the ultimate social execution. It meant the facade of wealth was a lie. Gregory's hands trembled as he tore open the seal of the envelope. Julian ripped his open simultaneously. I watched Julian's face. The smug satisfaction vanished. His skin turned the color of ash. His eyes scanned the bold black text on the cover sheet of the civil suit. The words jumped off the page. Civil action for real estate fraud. Civil action for extortion. Civil action for felony forgery. Julian looked up from the paper, his eyes finding mine across the room. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He realized the Cleveland property was never his. He realized the margin call was going to default on Monday morning. He realized his entire career at Crestview Capital was over. Gregory was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. He stared at the copies of the forged quitclaim deed attached as exhibits to the lawsuit. The evidence was irrefutable. His felony was documented and presented in front of the very people he relied on to fund his lifestyle. The bank executive who had been laughing with Gregory just minutes earlier quietly set his champagne glass down on a passing waiter tray and took a step backward, distancing himself from the toxic fallout. The contagion of ruin was spreading through the room. I walked slowly toward the center of the ballroom. The guests parted for me, their eyes wide with shock and curiosity. I stopped 2 feet away from my father. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form a single coherent word. The patriarch was broken. I did not yell. I did not throw a drink in his face. I kept my posture perfect and my voice chillingly calm. I mirrored the exact tone and cadence he had used on my graduation night. For the men who take the slow lane, I said quietly, let us hope you eventually figure out what to do with your lives. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. I left my father and my brother hyperventilating in the center of the Scioto Country Club, holding the undeniable proof of their own destruction. The echo of my leather heels was the only sound in the silent ballroom. I had severed the final string. The trap had closed. But a wounded animal is the most dangerous thing in the forest, and Julian was about to realize that losing his money was only the beginning of his nightmare. The speed at which high society turns on a bleeding target is a terrifying thing to witness. I did not have to lift another finger after I walked out of the Scioto Country Club. The ecosystem of Columbus wealth handled the execution for me. When you build your life on a foundation of optics, a single crack in the glass brings the entire structure down. By Monday morning, the rumor mill was operating at maximum capacity. The bank executives who witnessed the subpoena drop spent their Sunday afternoons making phone calls. They pulled public court records. They saw the fraud charges. They saw the evidence of the forged deed. Julian was the first to fall. He drove his leased Porsche to the Crestview Capitol parking garage at 7:30 on Monday morning. He swiped his keycard at the private executive entrance. The light flashed red. He swiped it again. Red. He walked around to the main lobby, ready to scream at the receptionist. Instead, the head of corporate compliance and two armed security guards met him at the glass turnstiles. Julian had used the secure Crestview servers to file the fraudulent property lien. Financial firms do not tolerate employees who use their network to commit felony wire fraud. The compliance officer handed Julian a single sheet of paper. It was a notice of indefinite unpaid administrative leave pending an internal audit and a federal regulatory review. They handed him a cardboard box containing his desk photographs and escorted him out the front door in full view of the morning commuter crowd. By noon, his brokerage firm triggered the margin call. Julian could not produce the cash. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on his Upper Arlington home. Gregory lasted exactly 3 days longer. Commercial real estate is an industry fueled by leverage and trust. Gregory possessed neither. The moment his primary lenders realized he was facing a civil suit for real estate fraud, they invoked the cross-default clauses buried deep in his loan contracts. A cross-default clause is a financial tripwire. If you default or face severe legal jeopardy on one asset, the bank has the right to demand immediate repayment on all other outstanding loans to protect their capital. The demand letters flooded Gregory Arena District Office. The banks wanted millions of dollars in cash and they wanted it within 10 days. Gregory tried to sell 2 of his commercial strip malls to cover the debt, but the title companies refused to clear the transactions while a fraud lawsuit hung over his head. His assets were frozen. His credit line was severed. The empire he spent 40 years building evaporated into thin air. They needed legal representation. They reached out to the expensive silk-stocking law firms they used to play golf with. Those firms ran a standard conflict check, looked at the tech conglomerate backing my civil suit, and demanded $50,000 retainers up front. Gregory and Julian did not have $50,000. Their bank accounts were locked by creditors. They ended up hiring a desperate strip mall defense attorney who specialized in traffic tickets and petty theft. The poor man was outmatched before he even filed his appearance. My corporate legal team initiated the discovery phase of the lawsuit. Discovery is the legal process where both sides must turn over their evidence. My lawyers buried the defense attorney in thousands of pages of unanswerable motions, forensic financial audits, and IP address logs. The defense lawyer realized very quickly that his clients had lied to him. He was defending indefensible felonies. While my father and brother drowned in legal paperwork, I was setting up my new life in Cleveland. The tech conglomerate finalized the logistics of their mineral excavation timeline. They moved me out of my cramped apartment and into a corporate penthouse suite near the lake. They provided me with a corner office in a glass high-rise, giving me a dedicated space to manage the upcoming offshore royalty payments. I sat behind a sleek modern desk overlooking the gray waters of Lake Erie. My cell phone sat next to my keyboard. It rang constantly. I did not answer it. I let every call filter straight to voicemail. The voicemails were exclusively from my mother. Sylvia spent my entire life avoiding conflict. She enabled Gregory cruelty because his real estate money funded her country club luncheons and her designer wardrobe. She turned a blind eye to Julian arrogance because he was the handsome son she could show off to her friends. She sacrificed my emotional well-being on the altar of her own comfort. Now that comfort was gone. The country club suspended their membership due to unpaid dues. The luxury cars were being repossessed. Sylvia was staring down a future in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. I pressed play on the voicemail application. Sylvia's voice filled the quiet corner office. Daniela, please pick up the phone. She was weeping. The polished artificial tone was gone, replaced by raw panic. You are destroying us. Your father is having chest pains. Julian cannot get out of bed. We are losing the house. You have to call these corporate lawyers and drop the lawsuit. Family does not do this to family. We can fix this. Please, Daniela, have some mercy. I listened to the message twice. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. Let us take a moment to talk about the concept of consequences. Have you ever noticed how toxic people view accountability? When you finally stand up and refuse to absorb their abuse, they never look in the mirror. They never admit their actions caused the fallout. Instead, they accuse you of attacking them. They frame your boundaries as an act of aggression. They cry victim the moment the fire they started begins to burn their own house down. If you have ever been called cruel simply because you let someone face the natural consequences of their own actions, you know exactly what I mean. Drop a comment below and share your experience. Remind yourself that holding people accountable is not revenge. It is just gravity taking hold. I deleted Sylvia voicemail. I did not owe them a rescue. Theodore built a test and they failed it through their own greed. But the legal process requires resolution. The tech conglomerate lawyers advised me that dragging the civil suit through a public trial would take years. The court dockets were backed up and Gregory's strip mall attorney was filing desperate delay tactics to keep his clients out of a courtroom for as long as possible. The conglomerate wanted the title clear so they could begin deploying the heavy excavation equipment to the Cleveland lot. I needed them to surrender the deed challenge permanently. I needed them to sign a binding admission of guilt and a waiver of all future claims against my grandfather's estate. I sent an email to my lead attorney. Offer them a formal mediation session, I instructed. Tell them I will sit down in a neutral room and discuss a settlement. Tell them if they refuse to attend, we hand the forgery evidence over to the district attorney and push for maximum prison sentences. I knew they would accept. They were broke, terrified, and desperate for any kind of lifeline. They thought mediation meant I was softening. They thought Sylvia tears had worked. They assumed they could walk into a conference room, play the family card, and manipulate me into dropping the charges in exchange for a half-hearted apology. They did not realize mediation was not a negotiation. It was an execution. I was setting the stage for the final confrontation. I was preparing to lay every single secret bare on a glass table and force them to look at the empire they threw away. The mediation was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. We convened in a neutral boardroom on the 38th floor of a downtown Columbus high-rise. The room was essentially a glass box suspended in the sky. It offered a sweeping panoramic view of the city my father used to think he owned. I sat on the east side of a long frosted glass table. Flanking me were two senior litigators from the tech conglomerate. They wore bespoke suits and radiated a calm corporate lethality. They did not carry thick files or cardboard boxes. They carried slim digital tablets and silver pens. They looked like predators resting in the shade. On the opposite side of the table sat my family. The physical deterioration of the Peterson men was startling. Julian looked 10 years older than the man who had smirked at my graduation dinner. His tailored navy blazer hung loosely on his shoulders, hinting at the weight he had lost over the past 3 weeks. He had dark circles under his eyes and a nervous twitch in his left hand. Sylvia sat beside him, clutching a crumpled tissue. Her posture was defeated. Gregory sat in the center. His eyes were bloodshot. The commanding presence he used to wield at country club dinners was hollowed out. He looked like a man who had not slept since the moment the process server handed him that envelope. Next to them sat their defense attorney, a sweating, overworked man, pulling stacks of disorganized paper from a worn canvas bag. The visual contrast between my elite legal team and their desperate defense counsel set the tone before a single word was spoken. A retired judge serving as the mediator sat at the head of the table. He recited the standard rules of engagement. He explained that this session was their final opportunity to reach a civil settlement before the case proceeded to trial, where the evidence of forgery would inevitably be handed over to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Before my lead attorney could present our initial terms, Gregory slammed his palm against the glass table. The loud smack echoed in the quiet room. He bypassed the lawyers entirely and locked his bloodshot eyes on me. "Stop this," Gregory demanded. His voice was hoarse and cracking. "I am your father, Daniela. I demand you end this childish revenge fantasy right now. You are acting like a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum over a misunderstanding." The defense attorney tried to quiet him, reaching out a hand, but Gregory pushed the man away. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You are dragging this family through the mud over a piece of useless dirt," Gregory hissed, leaning over the table. Grandpa Theodore was a fool. He was a senile old man who hoarded junk and left you a toxic liability. I was trying to save you from bankruptcy. I took steps to shield you from the environmental fines, and this is how you repay me. You hire corporate sharks to terrorize your own mother and brother. Julian chimed in, his voice rising in pitch. "You ruined my career, Daniela." "Over what?" "A scrapyard, a useless pile of rusted metal. You are destroying actual lives over garbage." I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice to defend my grandfather. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, rested my hands in my lap, and deployed the most devastating weapon in my arsenal: total silence. When you allow manipulators to speak without providing any emotional resistance, they eventually burn themselves out. They swing wildly at the air, scrambling for leverage that no longer exists. I watched my father exhaust his angry rhetoric. He spent 4 uninterrupted minutes demanding respect, insulting my intelligence, and framing himself as the ultimate victim. Finally, his voice gave out. He sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, waiting for my counterattack. He expected me to yell. He expected me to cry and demand an apology for the forgery. I looked at the retired judge. Then I reached down and unlatched the brass clasps on my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click cut through the heavy silence of the room. I reached inside. I did not pull out the civil lawsuit. I did not pull out the digital forensic logs tracing Julian felony. I pulled out the tarnished graduation medal. I placed it on the frosted glass table. It landed with a heavy, dense thud. "You threw this at me during my graduation dinner," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You called it a participation trophy for a daughter who takes the slow lane. You told 50 people I lacked the intellect to understand real estate." I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of glossy paper. It was the certified geological survey from the Independent Mining Commission. I slid it across the glass table. It stopped directly in front of Gregory. "Read the highlighted section on page 4, I instructed. Gregory hesitated. He looked at the document, then back at me. He slowly pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket and put them on. He looked down at the page. His eyes scanned the text. I watched the exact moment his reality fractured. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hands began to shake so violently that the paper rattled against the glass. "Neodymium," Gregory whispered, stumbling over the pronunciation. "Praseodymium. High-density deposit." I did not give him time to recover. I pulled the final document from my briefcase. It was a copy of the binding lease agreement. The signature lines were fully executed. I slid it across the table. It landed on top of the geological survey. "Grandpa Theodore was not a senile hoarder," I said. "He was an architect. He spent his entire life wearing grease-stained overalls so people like you would look the other way. He bought up industrial land, surveyed the bedrock beneath it, and quietly mapped the largest untapped rare earth mineral deposit in the state of Ohio. He secured the commercial zoning permits years ago." I pointed to the lease agreement. "Look at the second page, Gregory. Look at the financial terms. That is a binding lease with a global tech manufacturing conglomerate. The total contract value is $45 million. It includes a $5 million upfront operational payout." I tapped my finger against the heavy brass metal resting on the glass. "And that ugly tarnished trinket," I continued. "That was the physical security key to the private depository vault holding the paperwork. The fortune was locked until the heir holding the token signed the release." Julian leaned over his father's shoulder to look at the numbers. His jaw dropped. The breath hitched in his throat. Sylvia let out a short, choked gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Their eyes darted from the $45 million figure to the ugly brass medal resting on the table. The psychological devastation was absolute. They had not committed a felony to steal a piece of useless dirt. They had committed a felony to steal an empire, and they had failed. The trap was officially sprung. They realized that every insult they hurled at me, every threat they made, and every crime they committed was driven by their own blinding ignorance. They threw away their wealth, their reputations, and their freedom, all because they were too arrogant to look beneath the rust. They thought they were the smartest men in the room, but they had been outplayed by a dead man and a junior auditor. I watched their world shatter into 1,000 unfixable pieces. But I was not finished. The geological surveys and the tech contracts only proved how much money they lost. I wanted them to know exactly why they lost it. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a digital tablet. I had one final piece of evidence to present. It was a message recorded by Theodore himself, designed specifically for this exact moment. And it was going to ensure that Gregory and Julian never slept peacefully again. I set the digital tablet flat on the frosted glass. I tapped the screen once. The video player loaded. The audio filled the quiet mediation room. It was not a polished corporate recording. It was filmed on a shaky webcam inside the cramped wood-paneled office of the Cleveland scrapyard. Grandpa Theodore sat in his worn leather chair. He wore his signature grease-stained overalls. A cheap space heater buzzed in the background. He looked tired. His skin was pale and his breathing was shallow, but his eyes were sharp. They held the same piercing intelligence I remembered from my childhood. He looked directly into the camera lens. "If you are watching this," Theodore began, his voice gravelly and firm, "it means my idiot son and my arrogant grandson tried to steal from the only person in this family worth a damn. It means Daniela found the depository, secured the lease, and dragged you all into a room to face the music." Gregory flinched as if he had been physically struck. Julian stopped breathing. They stared at the digital screen, paralyzed by the voice of the man they thought they had outsmarted. Theodore leaned closer to the camera. "Let us talk about your inheritance, Gregory. You thought I lived like a pauper out of stubbornness. You thought I hoarded cash in municipal bonds just waiting for you to inherit it. You were wrong. Real estate requires capital and mining rights require political leverage." Theodore reached off screen and held up a thick binder. "I spent the last 10 years securing the bedrock beneath my scrapyard, but the city council wanted bribes and the environmental permits required heavy lobbying fees. I did not use my own cash to fund that operation. I used your inheritance." Julian gripped the edge of the glass table. His knuckles turned white. "I took out quiet, high-interest commercial loans against the Upper Arlington house." Theodore continued, a grim smile forming on his lips. "I leveraged the municipal bonds to their ultimate breaking point. I drained the equity out of every single asset I planned to leave to you two. I took all that borrowed money and I funneled it directly into securing Daniela rare earth mineral rights." The breath left Gregory's lungs in a sharp, ragged exhale. The reality of his situation crystallized in an instant. "You did not inherit a safety net," Theodore told the camera. "You inherited a ticking time bomb. The cash accounts you received were already promised to creditors. The house Julian lives in is leveraged to the hilt. I handed you a poisoned chalice disguised as a crown. If you had treated Daniela with an ounce of respect, if you had supported her, she might have used her tech lease to pay off your inherited debts. But I knew you. I knew you would look at her dirt and try to steal it. You triggered your own ruin." Theodore leaned back in his chair. He looked tired but deeply satisfied. "I gave the fools the shine," Theodore said softly, "and I gave the architect the foundation. Good luck paying the piper, Gregory." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the mediation room felt heavy, thick with the undeniable scent of total defeat. The two senior corporate litigators sitting beside me did not say a word. They simply watched the Peterson men process their own financial execution. I want to step out of the narrative right here to analyze the psychology of a poisoned chalice. When you deal with people who operate on pure ego, you realize they never verify the structural integrity of a gift. They only look at the wrapping paper. Narcissists are so obsessed with perception that they will gladly drink poison if it is served in a crystal goblet. My grandfather understood this fundamental flaw in American corporate culture. He knew my father and brother judged success by zip codes and tailored suits. He weaponized their own superficiality against them. They were so eager to grab the shiny real estate and the liquid cash that they never bothered to audit the debt attached to it. They lacked the discipline to look beneath the surface. If you have ever watched someone destroy their own life simply because they were too arrogant to read the fine print, you understand the exact mechanism of their downfall. I want you to leave a comment telling me about a time you saw arrogance blind someone to reality. Acknowledging these behavioral patterns is how we protect ourselves from falling into the same traps. Now back to the mediation room. Sylvia was the first to break the silence. She began to weep. It was not the delicate performative crying she used to elicit sympathy at country club luncheons. It was the ugly, visceral sobbing of a woman realizing her comfortable life was permanently over. Julian stared at the blank tablet screen. His mind was struggling to process the granular financial reality. He thought he was losing his house because of a bad margin call. He just learned he never actually owned the house in the first place. The equity was a ghost. His entire adult life was funded by phantom money. Gregory buried his face in his hands. He rubbed his eyes trying to wake up from a nightmare that was entirely real. "Let us review the math," I said, my voice cutting through Sylvia's sobbing. My tone was clinical, devoid of any sympathy. "You attempted to steal a $45 million asset to cover a deficit you could never actually clear." I turned my gaze to my brother. "Julian, your margin call triggered yesterday at the close of trading. Your brokerage firm is seizing your liquid accounts, but there is nothing to seize. The Upper Arlington house you plan to use as a lifeline is already leveraged by Theodore previous loans. You are currently carrying over $2 million in unsecured personal debt. You have no job. You have no financial licenses. You are functionally bankrupt." Julian did not argue. He just stared at his hands resting on his lap. The fight was entirely gone from him. I turned to my father. "Gregory, your commercial creditors invoked their cross-default clauses. Your strip malls are frozen, but that is the least of your problems. You drove to the Cuyahoga County clerk and filed a forged legal document. You committed a felony in a desperate attempt to save a son who was already financially dead." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the glass table. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life treating me like a ghost. "I control the wealth of the entire Peterson lineage," I stated. "I hold the tech conglomerate lease. I hold the mineral rights. I hold the undeniable evidence of your wire fraud. You walked into this room hoping to negotiate. You have nothing to negotiate with. Your power was an illusion, and the illusion is over." I sat back in my ergonomic chair. I uncrossed my legs and relaxed my posture. I watched them comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. There were no loopholes left. There were no wealthy friends to call. There were no favors left to call in. The elite corporate litigators beside me had secured every single exit. Gregory slowly lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red and wet. The pride was entirely stripped away. He looked at me not as a father looking at a daughter, but as a broken man looking at his executioner. He opened his mouth to speak. He was about to ask for the one thing he had never given me in my entire life. He was about to ask for a bailout, and his desperate plea was going to introduce the final ultimate test of my character. Gregory opened his mouth, but the words caught in his dry throat. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his silk tie. When he finally spoke, his voice was a frail whisper, stripped of the booming authority that used to echo through our childhood home. "Daniela," he pleaded, leaning over the frosted glass. "You cannot do this. You have to help us. We are your family." Sylvia let out a sharp sob. She reached across the table, her trembling fingers inches from my legal notepad. "Please, Daniela, Julian is going to go to prison. They are going to take the house. They are going to take everything. You have the tech money now. You have $5 million in cash sitting in an offshore account. You can fix this with a single phone call. Do not destroy your own blood." I sat back in my leather chair and studied them. The sheer audacity of their request hung in the air. For 24 years, they treated me like an invisible burden. They mocked my education. They refused to pay my tuition. They threw a tarnished piece of scrap metal at me and laughed while 50 of their friends watched. And the moment they realized that piece of scrap metal was worth tens of millions of dollars, they demanded I use it to save them from their own catastrophic greed. Julian finally lifted his head. His eyes were vacant. He did not beg. He was too deep in shock. He just stared at the geological surveys resting on the table, calculating the fortune he threw away because he was too arrogant to verify a deed. I looked at my lead attorney. He sat perfectly still, his digital tablet resting in his lap. He was waiting for my command. He was ready to pack up the files, walk out of the room, and hand the forgery evidence straight to the Ohio District Attorney. He was ready to let the legal system grind my father and brother into dust. Let us pause the story right here. I need to talk about the concept of revenge. When you survive a toxic family, you spend years imagining the moment you finally gain the upper hand. You imagine crushing them. You imagine watching them lose everything they value. But true power does not come from destruction. True power comes from discipline. If I let the corporate lawyers destroy my father and brother, I would be engaging in the exact same cruelty they practiced their entire lives. I would become the monster they raised. Furthermore, destroying them meant I would be tethered to them. I would have to attend criminal trials. I would have to give witness testimonies. I would have to spend the next 5 years of my life tied to their sinking ship in the court system. Revenge is a chain. Mercy is a door. I did not want to punish them. I just wanted to be free of them forever. If you have ever chosen to walk away from a fight you knew you could win simply because your peace was worth more than their pain, drop a comment below. Share your story. Because choosing clinical fairness over pure malice is the ultimate power move. I turned my attention back to my father. He was holding his breath, waiting for my verdict. I will not drop the civil suit based on family loyalty, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet boardroom. Family loyalty is a currency you bankrupted years ago. But I will offer you a settlement. It is a single, non-negotiable offer. If you attempt to alter a single clause, we leave this room and the felony charges are filed by noon. Gregory nodded frantically. Anything, he whispered. Just tell us what you want. I gestured to my second attorney. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a crisp white legal folder. She slid it across the glass table. It came to a stop right in front of Gregory. I will authorize a one-time transfer from my offshore accounts to cover your most immediate liabilities, I explained, keeping my tone devoid of emotion. I will pay the $1.2 million brokerage deficit Julian accumulated. This will satisfy the margin call and prevent the federal banking regulators from pursuing wire fraud charges against him for using Crestview Capital servers. Julian let out a ragged gasp. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I will also satisfy the primary commercial lender holding the cross-default tripwire on your strip malls, Gregory. I will pay the $3 million required to unfreeze those assets and stop the immediate foreclosure cascade. Gregory closed his eyes. A single tear escaped and tracked down his weathered cheek. Thank God, he breathed. Daniela, thank you. We will pay you back. We will restructure the firm. And I held up my hand, cutting him off instantly. The room went dead silent. You misunderstand the nature of this transaction, I said coldly. I am not giving you a loan. I am buying my permanent freedom. The financial bailout covers your criminal liabilities, but it does not save your lifestyle. You will still lose the country club memberships. You will still have to sell the luxury cars. You will be reduced to a standard working-class existence. I pointed to the white folder resting in front of him. Open it. Gregory opened the folder with trembling hands. The bailout is contingent on 3 binding conditions, I stated, reading the room with calculated precision. Condition 1. You and Julian will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You are legally barred from discussing my name, my business, Theodore Estate, or the rare earth mineral rights with any third party ever again. Gregory scanned the legal text, his eyes darting across the page. Condition 2, I continued. You will sign a permanent, irrevocable no-contact order. You forfeit the right to call me, email me, or approach any property I own or lease. You are legally barred from acknowledging my existence. If we cross paths in public, you will turn and walk the other way. Sylvia let out another sob. Daniela, you cannot mean that. I am your mother. You were a spectator to my abuse, Sylvia. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Gregory. Condition 3. You legally forfeit any future claims to my estate, my holdings, or the Peterson lineage. You are signing away your status as my family. I let the weight of the conditions settle over them. The hum of the city traffic 38 floors below was the only sound in the room. If you violate a single clause of this agreement, I promised, my voice dropping to a whisper. If you send me a birthday card, if you mention my name to a bank executive, if you drive past my Cleveland office, the non-disclosure agreement dissolves and the unredacted evidence of your forgery goes straight to the Ohio District Attorney. You will go to prison, Gregory, and I will make sure Julian goes with you. I gestured to the silver pen resting next to the folder. Sign it, or we go to trial. Gregory stared at this paperwork. He looked at the clauses that legally erased his daughter from his life. He looked at the clauses that saved him from a prison cell. He was a man who built his life on optics, and he was being forced to sign a document confirming he was a fraud. His hand shook as he reached for the silver pen. He uncapped it. He pressed the tip to the signature line. The scratching of the ink against the heavy paper was loud and final. He signed his name, surrendering his control, his pride, and his legacy. He slid the folder to Julian. Julian did not even read the clauses. He was too broken. He grasped the pen and scrawled his name, signing away the sister he used to mock. My lead attorney reached across the table and collected the folder. He reviewed the signatures, stamped them with a notary seal, and placed the documents back into his briefcase. The execution was complete, the trap was dismantled, and the predators were neutralized. They were not destroyed, but they were permanently disarmed. And as I watched them sit in the ruins of their own arrogance, I realized that true vindication does not require blood. It only requires the undeniable truth. The senior corporate litigators packed their digital tablets into their slim leather briefcases. The metallic click of the latches echoed with a sharp sense of finality. I did not look back at the frosted glass table. I did not look at the 3 people sitting in the ruins of their own hubris. I simply stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored wool suit, and walked out the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The descent down the elevator felt different than the ride up. The 38 floors dropped away in a smooth, quiet glide. When the elevator doors slid open in the main lobby, I stepped out into the bustling midday rhythm of downtown Columbus. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and walked onto Capitol Square. The brisk Ohio wind whipped across the pavement, carrying the faint scent of rain and exhaust. I stopped on the corner and took a deep breath. People who have never survived a toxic environment often assume that victory feels like a celebration. They think you walk out of a room after defeating your abusers and feel the sudden urge to pop champagne. But real life does not operate like a Hollywood revenge fantasy. Standing on that street corner, I did not feel triumphant. I felt a profound, heavy quiet. It was the specific, complicated grief of accepting a hard truth. I had just legally orphaned myself. I paid millions of dollars to ensure my own father and brother could never speak to me again. The transaction secured my safety, but it also killed the final lingering hope I harbored since childhood. The hope that maybe one day they would wake up and love me. You cannot buy love, and you cannot negotiate respect. I grieved for the family I deserved, but never received. I walked toward the adjacent parking garage to retrieve my car. As I stood near the exit ramp waiting for the crosswalk light to change, a familiar vehicle caught my eye. A silver Lexus sedan rolled down the concrete ramp and paused at the ticket booth. It was Gregory leased luxury car. I stood in the shadow of the building and watched them. Gregory sat behind the steering wheel. His posture was slumped, his shoulders rounded in a way I had never seen before. Sylvia sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window. Julian sat alone in the back, his head resting against the tinted glass. They did not speak to each other. The interior of the car looked like a tomb. The parking gate lifted. Gregory pulled the Lexus out onto the street. The sedan merged into the heavy afternoon traffic, its taillights glowing dull red before disappearing around the corner. That was the last time I ever saw them. The cord was officially cut. The surgical excision was complete. Let us pause for a moment and talk about the aftermath of walking away. Have you ever mourned the loss of someone who is still breathing? It is a strange, disenfranchised grief. Society understands mourning a physical death, but people rarely understand the pain of mourning a relationship you had to terminate for your own survival. If you have ever grieved the living because staying connected to them was destroying you, I want you to share your story in the comments. Acknowledge that complex pain. Validating that grief is the first step toward genuine healing. I drove my Honda Civic back to Cleveland that afternoon. I left Columbus in the rearview mirror, letting the distance insulate me from the fallout. And the fallout was swift. The non-disclosure agreement prevented Gregory and Julian from discussing the mediation, the mineral rights, or my grandfather true wealth. They could not go to their country club friends and play the victim. They could not explain why they suddenly vanished from the high society circuit. But in a community built on perception and whisper networks, silence often speaks louder than a press release. The Columbus business elite did not need the specific details to smell blood in the water. They only needed to observe the sudden drastic changes in the Peterson men. The offshore wire transfers cleared Gregory immediate commercial defaults and paid off Julian brokerage deficit. It kept them out of a federal courtroom, but it left them with zero operating capital. They were debt-free and entirely broke. Julian administrative leave at Crestview Capital transitioned into a quiet, unceremonious termination. The firm compliance officers did not press criminal charges honoring the settlement I orchestrated, but they permanently flagged his employment record. Julian tried to leverage his network to secure a position at a smaller boutique finance firm in the suburbs. The hiring managers took one look at his sudden exit from Crestview and declined to return his calls. He was a broker without a portfolio and a vice president without a desk. Gregory fared even worse. The Scioto Country Club requires its members to maintain a specific financial standing. When Gregory failed to pay his quarterly dues, the board of directors issued a polite but firm notice of suspension. A week later, a club attendant quietly emptied his mahogany locker, placing his expensive golf clubs and leather shoes into a cardboard box. Without his commercial real estate empire to generate income, Gregory could no longer afford the property taxes on the sprawling Upper Arlington estate. He listed the house for sale. The market was slow, forcing him to accept an offer well below his initial asking price just to secure the cash. My parents packed up 30 years of curated wealth and moved into a 2-bedroom condominium in a middle-class subdivision in Dublin. The luxury sedans were returned to the leasing agencies. The designer suits were relegated to a small walk-in closet. Gregory tried to hold court at a local diner on Tuesday mornings, attempting to impress the regular patrons with stories of his past deals, but nobody cared. He was just another retired man, drinking burnt coffee, living a life he used to mock. They were trapped in the exact ordinary existence they spent their entire lives running away from. I monitored none of this directly. I did not stalk their social media or hire private investigators to watch them suffer. The information filtered back to me months later through casual industry channels and former logistics contacts. Whenever I heard a new detail about their downsizing, I felt nothing. No joy, no pity. The emotional tether was truly severed. My focus remained entirely on the future. I returned to my glass-walled corner office overlooking Lake Erie. The environment could not have been more different from the cramped cubicle where I started my career. The tech conglomerate finalized the logistical planning for the Cleveland lot. From my window, I watched the heavy excavation equipment roll onto the gritty, poisoned soil of Theodore Old Scrapyard. The bulldozers stripped away the rusted metal and the contaminated topsoil, revealing the solid bedrock beneath. They were literally unearthing the foundation my grandfather promised me. I spent my days managing the offshore royalty accounts, auditing the excavation timelines, and reviewing secondary investment portfolios. I hired my own financial advisors. I built a corporate infrastructure designed to protect and multiply the wealth Theodore trusted me to manage. The discipline I learned while being ignored by my family became the cornerstone of my new empire. I did not buy flashy sports cars or frequent exclusive country clubs. I drove a reliable vehicle. I lived in a secure, comfortable penthouse. I operated with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what it takes to survive a hostile takeover. My family tried to weaponize my isolation. They tried to use my silence as proof of my weakness. They never realized that every day they left me alone in the dark, my eyes were adjusting. I had survived their toxicity, and I had neutralized their threats. But building an empire is only the first step. The true test of wealth is figuring out who you become once the war is over. I had the foundation. Now I had to decide what kind of legacy I was going to build on top of it. 6 months have passed since the mediation room in Columbus. The brutal Ohio winter surrendered to a thick, humid summer. I sit in my penthouse office on the 42nd floor of a high-rise overlooking the Cleveland skyline. The view is spectacular. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, I can see the Cuyahoga River winding its way toward Lake Erie. But my favorite view is not the water. It is the sprawling plot of land sitting on the industrial edge of the city. From up here, the old scrapyard looks like a busy anthill. The tech conglomerate broke ground 3 weeks ago. The rusted sedans and crushed aluminum are gone. In their place sits a fleet of heavy excavation machinery. The air down there is thick with diesel exhaust and the sound of drills biting into the bedrock. They are extracting the neodymium and praseodymium. They are pulling the future of clean energy straight out of the dirt my father called a toxic liability. My office reflects the new reality. It is minimalist and functional. The walls are painted a crisp slate gray. The furniture is dark, solid mahogany. But sitting right in the center of my desk is an object that does not match the pristine corporate aesthetic. It is the heavy, tarnished brass graduation medal. I did not throw it away. I hired a custom framer to build a thick tempered glass display case for it. It rests on a velvet cushion front and center on my workspace. The laser-etched binary codes are still hidden along the rim. It is the first thing I see when I sit down with my morning coffee, and it is the last thing I see when I turn off the overhead lights. People who visit my office always ask about it. They assume it is a rare artifact or a military commendation. I never tell them the true origin story. I just tell them it is a reminder to always read the fine print. Running an empire requires a different kind of vigilance than surviving a toxic family. When you have money, the predators do not disappear. They just wear better suits. Just yesterday, I faced a new kind of test. A senior vice president from a secondary logistics firm flew in from Chicago to pitch a supply chain partnership. He sat in the leather guest chair across from my desk. He was a man in his late 50s wearing a charcoal blazer and a gold watch. He looked at me, a 24-year-old woman running a multi-million-dollar mineral operation, and he made an arrogant assumption. He assumed I was new money. He assumed I was out of my depth. He slid a partnership contract across my mahogany desk. The terms were predatory. He offered a flat rate for freight transport, while burying variable fuel surcharges and hidden administrative fees deep within the appendix. He smiled a warm, practiced smile, assuring me the deal was standard industry practice and designed to take the logistical burden off my shoulders. He sounded exactly like Julian offering to take the burden of the scrap lot off my hands. 6 months ago, a man like that might have intimidated me, but surviving the Peterson family war hardened my instincts. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward, tapped my fingernail against the glass display case holding my brass medal, and deployed the data. I opened my laptop and projected a spreadsheet onto the wall monitor. I broke down his fuel surcharge formula line by line. I cross-referenced his proposed administrative fees against the current Midwest shipping averages. I exposed a 20% markup hidden in the transit schedule. I dismantled his entire predatory contract in less than 5 minutes using raw, undeniable mathematics. The color drained from his face. The warm smile vanished. He realized he was not sitting across from a naive heir. He was sitting across from a forensic auditor who owned the ground beneath his feet. I slid his contract back across the desk. I told him to revise the figures to reflect current market value, remove the hidden fees, and return next week if he wanted a seat at my table. He packed his briefcase in silence and practically ran out to the elevator. The conflict never truly ends. The world will always try to test your boundaries. People will always try to extract your value for their own gain. The difference is that now I dictate the terms of engagement. I hold the power to say no, and I have the infrastructure to enforce it. I want to step out of the narrative right here and speak directly to you. We spend so much of our lives letting other people calculate our worth. We listen to parents who tell us we take the slow lane. We listen to siblings who tell us we lack intellect. We internalize the laughter of crowds and the cruel jokes told over dinner tables. We accept the garbage they hand us because we are conditioned to believe we do not deserve anything better. But true worth is never determined by the people trying to keep you small. Your value is not dictated by a zip code, a luxury car, or a country club membership. Your value is inherent. It is built in the quiet hours when nobody is watching. It is forged in the grueling work you do to educate yourself, to protect yourself, and to build a life of substance. My grandfather Theodore understood this. He wore grease-stained overalls and drove a rusted truck because he knew that real power does not need to announce itself. He knew that the foundation is always more important than the shine. He left me a poisoned scrapyard because he needed to know I had the strength to dig through the dirt to find the gold. You do not need a secret inheritance to prove your value. You do not need a multi-million-dollar mineral lease to validate your existence. You just need to give yourself permission to stop seeking approval from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors. When you build a wall, you trap yourself inside with your own resentment. You spend your energy guarding the perimeter against people who want to hurt you. But when you build a door, you give yourself the power to exit. You give yourself the authority to turn the handle, step out of the burning building, and lock the danger behind you. Boundaries allow you to curate your reality. They let you decide who gets access to your time, your energy, and your heart. My family spent 24 years trying to convince me I was nothing. I did not need to destroy them to prove they were wrong. I just needed to walk through the door and build a life where their opinions no longer carried any currency. I found my peace in the cold, clinical execution of fairness. I found my freedom the moment I realized I did not need their love to survive. If you are watching this, and you recognize yourself in my story, I want to hear from you. If you have ever been the scapegoat, the invisible one, or the family disappointment, if you have ever had to pack your bags and walk away from people who shared your blood but refused to share their respect, I want you to drop a comment below. Tell me about the moment you finally realized your own worth. Tell me about the boundaries you built to protect your peace. Reading your stories validates this journey and proves that none of us are truly fighting alone. Hit the subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a lesson in claiming your own power. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that they are not what their abusers say they are. You are the architect of your own foundation. Do not let anyone else hold the pen to your story. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Until next time, this is Daniela Peterson, and I am finally building my own empire. I stand by the glass window of my office and watch the sun set over Lake Erie. The heavy excavation machines power down for the evening. The industrial site goes perfectly quiet. It has been a long and exhausting journey from that country club dining room to this corporate penthouse. I did not just survive the cruelty of my family. I learned how to dismantle their toxic illusions and build my own undeniable reality. When you walk through a fire like that, you do not come out the same person. You come out forged, you come out sharpened, and ready for whatever the world throws at you next. I want to share the 5 core truths that this entire experience taught me. These are the exact principles that built my empire and protected my peace of mind. First, you must understand that true value rarely shines. The people who spend their lives polishing their public image are usually hiding a crumbling foundation. My grandfather knew that real wealth and genuine character are often buried in the dirt. Do not ever let arrogant people dictate your worth based on their own superficial standards. Second, you must learn to weaponize your silence. Toxic people feed on your emotional reactions. They want you to argue and cry and defend yourself because it gives them absolute control over the narrative. When you give them nothing but calm and clinical silence, you starve them of their power. You force them to sit in the uncomfortable reality of their own poor decisions. Third, you must always read the fine print. Whether it is a commercial real estate lease or a complicated family relationship, you have to look beneath the surface. My father and brother lost everything they valued because they were too arrogant to audit their own inheritance. Assume nothing and verify everything. The raw data will always tell you the truth even when the people you love are lying to your face. Fourth, you need to realize that boundaries are not acts of revenge. Boundaries are simply doors. When you set a firm boundary, you are not punishing your abusers. You are protecting your own future. Walking away from people who fundamentally disrespect your existence is the most profound act of self-preservation you can ever commit. You do not owe anyone permanent access to your life just because you share a last name. Fifth and finally, you must recognize that mercy is the ultimate display of power. It is incredibly tempting to crush the people who hurt you when you finally hold all the leverage. But revenge ties you to them forever. It forces you to operate on their toxic level. By choosing clinical fairness over pure malice, you sever the emotional cord completely. You buy your permanent freedom and you let gravity do the heavy lifting for you. I look at the heavy brass metal resting on my desk one last time today. It is a constant reminder that the tools for our liberation are often disguised as heavy burdens. We just have to be brave enough to look closer. We have to be willing to strip away the rust to find the solid core beneath. You have the power to define your own worth. You have the absolute authority to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. I hope my journey reminds you that you are the sole architect of your own foundation. If this story resonated with you, I want you to leave a comment below and share your own experiences with setting hard boundaries. Please subscribe to Senior Echo Stories and turn on notifications so we can continue sharing these journeys together. Thank you for listening, and remember that your true value is entirely in your own hands.